Hello, and welcome to Feminist Futures. I'm your host, Janessa Eddy, and this is a show that I have been developing for a while. So I'll tell you a little bit about it, what I'm trying to do, and hopefully at the end of it, get some feedback. It's a work in progress. We're all working on it together, right? So anyway, Feminist Futures. So the first part, feminist, I kind of take a broad view in this context, at least, of feminism. I'm thinking of more equitable systems, social systems, critiquing power, trying to, through politics, etc., creating a better, more sustainable and equitable future that's based on caring and community and hope and all that good stuff. So that kind of leads to the next part, the futures part. I feel that I'm a huge political talk junkie. I listen to all types of political commentary and stuff. A lot of it's very dark and fearful, and I mean in a way that's effective because that's what sells in this country in particular. But I'm trying to change that up. I want to offer that little island in the middle of the ocean of saying, the world is tough. We are facing a lot of issues, but they are fixable. A lot of these issues we have are socially created. So not necessarily you and me in every case, but we as people have created it so we can fix it, which is both frustrating that this is what we've created, but also hopeful and positive in that we can change it and we can create better, more equitable systems based on solutions that are, more based in reality and facts than what we see today. And yeah, just at its core, trying to make a better future for us and our children. Think of the children, right? So anyway, this show, besides being that little island of hope, right, in the sea of fear and anger and stuff like that, I also would say that this show provides a unique view in many other ways. So I am a trans woman. I'm gay. I'm pretty sure I'm on the autism spectrum. I've been in academia. I'm working on my master's degree right now. Hopefully, knock on wood, I'll get into a doctoral program here soon. We'll see. But a lot of my studies have been around politics, philosophy, feminism, all types of different things. And but that doesn't; those limited things don't constrain my thinking, though. I am very interested in all types of different things, learning new things. I love. And I think this is where the feedback part is important, right? I want to experience what other people, are experiencing. I love diverse views, people who I may disagree with, just trying to figure out how they think, how they see the world, as much as possible, as much as my mental capacity, right, will allow. Yeah. So that's kind of the idea. The format of this show, I've always been super fascinated in political commentary, especially old school political talk radio. I kind of want to keep that format, but with less, less offensiveness, less crudeness that a lot of the old traditional, political talkers did. But I like that format. I mean, I guess I'm old school in that respect of, I think audio, video, especially radio, does a good job of creating more of that personal connection than maybe TV or cable news does, and I kind of like that. And it has its certain, power to it, right? It's certain endearing qualities, despite some of the toxic stuff that it has produced in the past. And lastly, why this show? As you can probably tell, I'm a yapper. Like, I will talk for a long time, and so I just need a outlet to kind of channel those energies. So maybe I should say enjoy or sorry. I don't know which one you like. You're gonna have to figure that out on your own. But yeah, so I'm just talking about the stuff I'm interested in, trying to build communities, trying to build coalitions. I've done quite a bit of political work, campaign work, so I know kind of the ins and outs. And I want to share all that information, all that insider information, right, with you guys. And let's try to build something here, build something positive, something that can help more people. So I kind of already got into this, but I am, like I said, I'm trans, I'm gay, an academic. I also work with my kind of other job right now is I work with people with different developmental and intellectual disabilities. So think like autism, different things like that, related things like that. So anyway, I'll go through a bit of my personal history here, and I won't, I'm not going to touch everything. There's just not enough time. Some of it I'll save for next episode. But some of it, if you're curious, if you don't think I've explained something to its full extent or didn't hit on the topic you would be interested in, definitely let me know, and we can always circle back around to it, right? But anyway, here we go. Here's a brief little thing. So, where to start? I grew up in the Midwest, and even though I'm not living in the Midwest right now, still have that mentality, right? Which I kind of value. I mean, just like any other perspective we may have, there's goods and bads to it. But that's like a lot of my thinking. My family didn't own a farm, but we lived around a lot of farmers, right? So me and my siblings did some farm work. If you ever want to learn about life, go work or volunteer on a farm. Like, you will learn more than you probably ever went to, honestly. Anyway, so grew up in the Midwest, and I was kind of an odd kid. So like when I was in grade school, I was not not the obedient child, so to speak. I'm always been a very outside the box thinker. And, sometimes that drove my parents and teachers crazy, but it is what it is. We've moved on. I've chilled down a little bit in adulthood. And then it was probably about middle school, I would say, I started calming down. My parents were like, you should get into sports or something, right, to burn all your energy. So I did. I particularly enjoy contact sports. I played rugby in college, play a little bit of football in high school, not too much. I've always been very involved with different types of martial arts. So I've, done wrestling, jiu-jitsu, all types of different things like that. And I also, another thing that I do is, it's called practical shooting. I basically describe it as, you just basically go through an obstacle course, shoot at paper targets, with your with your pistol, your handgun. There's also other variations of it. But yeah, so I try to stay active, try to do interesting things like that. And yeah, so anyway, I was saying, middle school, I kind of calmed down, got more into sports. High school was definitely like turning into like the awkward kid. I would say I'm a natural introvert. Although some people would some of my friends would just be like, really? but yeah. So I was a crazy child, elementary, middle school, turned into a pretty like awkward kid in high school and undergrad. But anyway, I think a lot of it was just like trying to deal with, although I didn't have any words for it at the time, like trying to figure out, this gender stuff, right? Like hanging out with the boys and stuff. I always felt like a little different, and I just noted it, left it in the back of my mind. And it really wasn't until undergrad and graduate school where it really was popping back up and kind of like taking control of my life in certain ways, to the point of, well, I should probably like try to figure this out, So yeah, that was kind of secondary school stuff. Also with it, I guess the other big thing is within that time, my family was pretty into talk radio, so I listened to a lot of talk radio. That was kind of my escape, my own little world. And because of that, I developed a passion, I guess you would say, interest in politics. So when I was in high school, going into undergrad, I was just like, unlike a lot of people that go into undergrad, I knew immediately what I wanted to do. I looked for a school that kind of specialized kind of in like political science, philosophy, stuff like that. And so, yeah, that's what I did. It was in college that I was doing political science. The particular school I was going to was a small liberal arts college. It was also Catholic, so there was an emphasis on like old school liberal arts, right? You gotta study the classics, right? Plato, Aristotle, Dante, all those different types of things. So it probably wasn't until like maybe my sophomore year, I want to say, I took a political philosophy course and immediately fell in love with that. And that kind of led me to, I kind of want to do philosophy and not necessarily politics, although I was still very active in both. So yeah, that's kind of where I was there. I was also, interestingly, as a kid, I was at least in undergrad, it was around the time of, I don't know if anybody remembers Ron Paul, but he was he was a congressman from Texas at the time. He passed on several years ago. Although his son, Rand Paul, is in the Senate right now. He's one of the senators from Kentucky. He's been there quite a long time. Don't necessarily agree a lot with the son, but Ron Paul was, in Texas. He was originally a doctor. I forget what field of medicine he did, if he was just like a general practitioner or what he did. Anyway, but he got into politics, was pretty big and this was long before Trump. This was like even pre Obama era, so long time ago, right? Still when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, like that long ago. Yeah, he was a very unique character, but I liked him because he was like about one of, at least in my mind, one of the like truest libertarians I've I've ever encountered. His big thing was audit the Fed, which actually ended up happening eventually. The Fed is the Federal Reserve. It's basically a collection of banks. It's a centralized bank basically. So it's not part of the government per se, but the people that run it are approved by the government. It's kind of like the cabinet. It's the president appoints and, Senate confirms, that type of thing. But anyway, it deals with all the monetary policy in our country. So like interest rates is probably the biggest thing that everybody talks about, the Fed. They set interest rates. They help keep the banking sector regulated in certain ways. So they're like bankers, but they're also like kind of politicians. It's a weird hybrid that the U.S. switched to last century, many decades ago. But anyway, he was concerned, being libertarian. He was always skeptical and talking about various different institutions, and being a skeptical like person myself, just that like mindset of the philosopher, right? Of always questioning everything. I think that's probably what initially drew me to him. He was also funny enough, a no borders person. So his line was always just like, walls are put up to keep people out, but actually what happens is it keeps us in, it keeps us restrained. So oddly enough, like he had very certain, like, and this is kind of libertarian ideology in some ways, like some views that we would consider very like conservative, right wing, but then he had like a lot of like liberal issues, right? Like gay marriage, he was just like, why is the government even regulating marriage? That type of thing. Just very like hardcore, as little government as possible in your life. And at least he was kind of equal with it, right? He was just like, yeah, I want, the government in my life as an old, heterosexual white man. Like I want as little government in my life, just as I want as little government in your life, whether, you're a gay person, someone that's not from European ancestry, which has its pros, which has its pros and cons. We can delve into that deeper. But anyway, all that is to say, like I was originally, when I really, was finding myself originally, I was very like libertarian, Ron Paul supporter. And yeah, so that was most of college. I remember like the election after that, that was during like Obama's initial election and before. But then during Obama's re-election against Mitt Romney, I actually kept up. Ron Paul was more or less out of politics at that point. But anyway, there was, I like voted for the libertarian candidate. You can criticize me, whatever. I threw my vote away, but I don't know. I felt like, no, I didn't totally like what Obama or Romney were offering. So, and I was still pretty like active libertarian in many ways. So yeah, that was most of undergrad. And then I would say it wasn't really until grad school and coming out as trans and gay that I really got into more like left-wing not just like democratic politics, but like beyond that, like very like leftist politics, because basically, I made this calculus of like, okay, I'm like queer. What do I do with this? How do I protect myself and other queer people and other people? And the only people that were really offering any help or solutions were at the time were the Democratic Party. So I kind of got involved with that. Although I've never really been a party person. A lot of people say that. Like, I've always been independent, registered. Yeah, for like primaries and stuff, I'll kind of choose which primary I want to participate in. But pretty much for the most part, I've been independent, registered independent. So, there's some stuff that's good in each party. There's a lot of bad stuff. But anyway, I try to take it. And we'll get into this. Get into this more next episode. But I kind of take it, or at least I try take it issue by issue. Candidate by candidate, like as much as I can. So yeah. So anyway, that's where I was, and like I said, it wasn't really until like late undergrad, into grad school that my gender identity and sexual orientation were really, like, I was so confused about. It just caused me a lot of issues. I eventually went into the graduate program I was in at the time, which was actually cognitive science, so studying the brain, that type of thing. Had, free counseling sessions for students. So I'm like, what the heck, I'll go in. Met with a counselor, basically like working with a counselor, figured out, I was definitely trans and gay. And yeah, and I got to hang out with the head of the LGBT center at the time at that college. They invited me to an intro to LGBT studies course they were teaching that semester. And it was a class on the history of, transgender people and the trans movement in the U.S. It was brilliant. I loved it, related a lot, obviously. But two, I also realized that funny enough, a lot of the issues that like classic Western philosophy is concerned with, like the things that Plato and Aristotle, for instance, were talking about, were like being brought up and rediscussed, in queer studies, feminism, gender studies. And it was kind of at that point, I'm like, that's what I want to do. Like, I want to study gender. And so that's basically what I'm doing. And the nice thing is gender studies is pretty interdisciplinary. So I actually was at the philosophy department at the University of Nebraska for a little bit. Unfortunately, didn't get any funding. So I was just like, dude, unfortunately, I gotta drop out and like find a real job. And it was about that time, or all around that time, like, that I was doing political activism, especially for queer issues. I worked on several different campaigns ranging from local politics up to national politics. Yeah, just doing all types of stuff, kind of getting in the streets, that type of thing. Anyway, so that kind of ended up, like I said, I ended up at the University of Nebraska for like a year. And then after that, I'm like, I can't afford this. So then I kind of by accident, almost, I ended up in this career field that I am now, working with people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, which is a whole nother world. I tell you what, it's, you think you've seen everything, and then you go into work and you're like, what the hell did I just see? It's a wild, it's fun. It's also very rewarding because you're helping people in their day-to-day lives. Also I've helped with a lot of research around autism issues. So, public education, trying to help other marginalized communities, I really relate to. And so, I would say like that job and academics, writing, doing research, and obviously this podcasting are like three of the things that I'm just like, I could, these are jobs I like. These are things I want to do. I want to write. I want to publish books, podcasts, different things like that. I want to help, various marginalized people make a more equal, accepting society. So I'm just all over the place. Like I was saying earlier, like my tastes are very broad and eclectic. So are my interests. I'll have a conversation with just about anyone. So that's basically it. Right now, I guess the last thing I'll say, right now I am working on, I said this already, but I'm working on my master's degree in women's and gender studies, writing my thesis right now, trying to wrap that up by May so I can graduate. And then I'm waiting to hear back from a couple doctoral programs in women's and gender studies. So I mean, we'll see what happens with that. I'll keep you guys updated. But in the meantime, I'm doing this show here and trying to live my best life, trying to manage, my mental health as we all are. So that's kind of who I am, and what this show's about, what I'm trying to do here. This is just scratching the surface. Like I said, please connect with me, email questions, things that you would love for me to discuss. I'm all for it. I love it. Anyway, we're going to move on to more of the news stuff that's happening. And for today, I found this interesting article a couple days ago. And it was kind of an interesting piece, right? Like I have to, I go through so much news every day. You kind of have to learn how to like filter and find those little hidden gems. Because unfortunately, a lot of the news we have now is just like rage bait and just kind of like garbage. I mean, I don't want to dismiss or knock down like every news agency. There's still a lot of great journalism happening. It just seems like it's harder to find. And so, this was one of the articles that kind of rose to the top the other day. I'll read it, see what you guys think, and then I'll kind of talk about why I was kind of drawn to it, why I think it's important. So here we go. 1 second here. All right. So this article is from The Atlantic. The Atlantic is kind of like I would say more like a news journal. So it's kind of more longer form articles, a little deeper, more in depth. Not so much like the breaking news, but more of like different people's takes on trends, in politics, economics, stuff like that. I would say it's kind of a lot of, news aggregators and commentators and stuff would probably say it's center left. I would say so. I mean, just based on kind of the topics they take on, some of the stances some of their authors take. So I feel like that's important to know, whatever news source you're looking at, to try to, as best you can, try to understand their biases, right? Because it will help you better gauge, and judge the information that you're receiving. And the Atlantic is just one of them. So this article is a little old now, I will admit. It's from January 25th, 2026, so last month. And it is written by let me scroll down here, find this guy's little bio they wrote. So yeah, the author here is Jonathan Rauch. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. Jonathan Rauch is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a senior fellow in the governance studies programs at the Brookings Institute. The Brookings Institute, it's a think tank in Washington. So basically they just sit around and try to come up with new ideas, new policy ideas, different things like that. And DC is full of them. I mean, I tell you, it's wild. But the Brookings Institute, again, I would say, like, similar to the Atlantic, is probably like center left, I would say. If you go to their website and read, or Wikipedia or whatever, and read up a bit on them, they're originally created to, kind of approach economics, politics through like the social sciences. So like politics, sociology, or political science, sociology, psychology, things like that, which usually tend to be, a lot of those fields tend to be kind of left, in the sense of they're concerned about understanding and critiquing social structures. But yeah, that's just kind of a very brief explanation. But anyway, listen to this article, judge for yourself. Okay, and then the last part here, it says, Rauch most recently authored Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. So he's published several books as well. If you're interested, go look it up. Some of the books I've run into that I've seen from him are pretty interesting. I'm adding them to my reading list for sure. Anyway, okay, here we go. Take it from the top, right? Yeah. All right. Yes, it's fascism. Until recently, I thought it a term best avoided, but now the resemblances are too many and too strong to deny. So that was the title and byline. Here we go. Until recently, I resisted using the F word to describe President Trump. For one thing, there were too many elements of classical fascism that didn't seem to fit. For another, the term has been overused to the point of meaninglessness, especially by left-leaning types who call you a fascist if you oppose abortion or affirmative action. For yet another, the term is hazily defined, even by its adherents. From the beginning, fascism has been an incoherent doctrine, and even today, scholars can't agree on its definition. Italy's original version differed from Germany's, which differed from Spain's, which differed from Japan's. I accepted President Biden's characterization of the MAGA movement as quote-unquote semi-fascist because some parallels were glaringly apparent. Trump was definitely an authoritarian and unquestionably a patrimonialist. Beyond that, though, the best description seemed to be a psychological one propounded by John Bolton, Trump's first-term national security advisor. Quote, he listens to Putin, he listens to Xi, he listens to how they talk about governing unburdened by uncooperative legislatures, unconcerned with the judiciary, what the judiciary may do, and he thinks to himself, why can't I do that? This doesn't amount to being a fascist in my view, or having a theory of how you want to govern. It's just, why can't I have the fun they are? Writing a year ago, I argued that Trump's governing regime is a version of patrimonialism, in which the state is treated as the personal property and family business of the leader. That is still true. But as I also noted then, patrimonialism is a style of government, not a formal ideology or system. It can be layered upon all kinds of organizational structures, including not just national governments, but also urban political machines such as Tammany Hall, criminal gangs such as the mafia, and even religious cults. Because its only firm principle is personal loyalty to the boss, it has no specific agenda. Fascism, in contrast, is ideological, aggressive, and at least in its early stages, revolutionary. It seeks to dominate politics, to crush resistance, and to rewrite the social contract. Over Trump's past year, what originally looked like an effort to make the government his personal plaything has drifted distinctly towards doctrinal and operational fascism. Trump's appetite for Lebensraum, his claim of unlimited power, his support for the global far right, his politicization of the justice system, his deployment of performative brutality, his ostentatious violation of rights, his creation of a national paramilitary police, all of those developments bespeak something more purposeful and sinister than run-of-the-mill greed or gangsterism. When the facts change, I change my mind. Recent events have brought Trump's governing style into sharper focus. Fascist best describes it, and reluctance to use the term has now become perverse. That is not because of any one or two things he and his administration have done, but because of the totality. Fascism is not a territory with clearly marked boundaries, but a constellation of characteristics. When you view the stars together, the constellation plainly appears. Demolition of norms. From the beginning of his first presidential run in 2015, Trump deliberately crashed through every boundary of civility. He mocked Senator John McCain's war heroism, mocked fellow candidate Carly Fiorina's face, seemingly mocked the Fox News host Megyn Kelly's menstruation, slurred immigrants, and much more. Today, he still does it, recently making an obscene gesture to a factory worker and calling a journalist quote-unquote pig. This is a feature of the fascist governing style, not a bug. Fascists know that what the American founders called the, quote, Republican virtues, unquote, impede their political agenda. And so they gleefully trash liberal pieties such as reason and reasonableness, civility and civic spirit, toleration and forbearance. By mocking decency and saying the unsayable, they open the way for what William Galston has called the dark passions, quote unquote, of fear, resentment, and especially domination, the kind of politics that shifts the public discourse to ground on which liberals cannot compete. Glorification of violence. Every state uses violence to enforce its laws, but liberal states use it reluctantly, whereas fascism embraces and flaunts it. Trump thus praises a violent mob, endorses torture, muses fondly about punching, body shaming, body slamming, and shooting protesters and journalists, and reportedly suggests shooting protesters and migrants. His recruitment ads for ICE glamorize military-style raids of homes and neighborhoods. His propaganda takes childish delight in the killing of civilians, and we have all seen videos of agents dragging people out of cars and homes, partly because the government films them. Like the demolition of civic decency, the valorization of violence is not incidental to fascism. It is part and parcel. Might is right. Also characteristic of fascism is what George Orwell called, quote-unquote, bully worship. The principle that, as Thucydides famously put it, quote, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, unquote. This view came across in Trump's notorious Oval Office meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in which Trump showed open contempt for what he regarded as Ukraine's weakness. It came across explicitly and chillingly when Stephen Miller, the president's most powerful aide, told CNN's Jake Tapper, quote, we live in a world, in the real world, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world that have existed since the beginning of time, unquote. Those words, though alien to the traditions of American and Christian morality, could have come from the lips of any fascist dictator. Politicized law enforcement. Liberals followed the law whether they like it or not. Fascists only when they like it. Nazism featured a, quote, dual state, unquote, where at any moment the protection of ordinary law could cease to apply. Trump makes no secret of despising due process of law. He has demanded countless times that his opponents be jailed, quote unquote, lock her up chant, and his endorsement were a prominent feature of the 2016 campaign. And he has suggested the Constitution's quote unquote termination and said, quote, I don't know, unquote, when asked if he is required to uphold it. His single most dangerous second-term innovation is the repurposing of federal law enforcement to persecute his enemies and shield his friends. No prior president has produced anything like Trump's direct and public order for the Justice Department to investigate two former officials, or like his blatantly retaliatory prosecutions of James Comey and Letitia James. Quote, at least 470 people, organizations, and institutions have been targeted for retribution since Trump took office, an average of more than one a day, unquote. Reuters reported in November, and today one can add others to the list, beginning with Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. Had Trump done nothing else, his demolition of independent and apolitical law enforcement would still have moved the U.S. government closer than ever before to a fascistic model. Dehumanization. Fascism draws its legitimacy from its claims of defending the people from enemies who are animals, criminals, brutes. Trump characterizes, for instance, political opponents as quote-unquote vermin and immigrants as quote-unquote garbage who are quote-unquote poisoning the blood of our country. Language straight out of the Third Reich. Vice President Vance, as a senator, endorsed a book called Unhumans, a title that refers to the left, and who can forget his false claim that Haitians abduct and eat pet cats and dogs. Police state tactics. Trump has turned ICE into a sprawling paramilitary that roasts the country at will, searches and detains non-citizens and citizens without warrants, uses force ostentatiously, operates behind masks, receives skimpy training, lies about its activities, and has been told that it enjoys quote-unquote absolute immunity. He more than doubled the agency's size in 2025, and its budget is now larger than those of all other federal law enforcement agencies combined, and larger than the entire military budget of all but 15 countries. Quote, this is going to affect every community, unquote. Every community, every city, unquote. The Cato Institute scholar David Beyer recently observed, really, quote, really almost everyone in our country is going to come in contact with this one way or another, unquote. In Minneapolis and elsewhere, the agency has behaved provocatively, sometimes brutally, and arguably illegally. Behaviors that Trump and his staff have encouraged, shielded, and sent camera crews to publicize, perhaps in the hope of eliciting violent resistance that would justify further crackdowns, a standard fascist stratagem. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem's recent appearance with a sign reading, "One of ours, all of ours," seemed to nod toward another fascist standby collective punishment, as did the administration's decision to flood Minneapolis with thousands of officers after residents there began protesting federal tactics, a prioritization that was explicitly retributive. Undermining elections. Trump's recent musing that there should be no 2026 election may or may not have been jocular, as the White House has maintained. But he and his MAGA supporters believe they never lose an election, period. They went to great lengths to overturn the 2020 election, as the prosecutor Jack Smith's indictment of Trump and subsequent report detail ad nauseum. Rigging, stealing, or outright canceling elections is, of course, job one for fascists. Although Trump is term limited, we must not expect that he and his MAGA loyalists will voluntarily turn over the White House to a Democrat in 2029, regardless of what the voters say. And the second insurrection will be far better organized than the first. What's private is public. Classical fascism rejects the fundamental liberal distinction between the government and the private sector. Per Mussolini's dictum, quote, no individuals or groups outside the state, unquote. Among Trump's most audacious, if only intermittently successful initiatives are his efforts to commandeer private entities, including law firms, universities, and corporations. One of his first acts as president last year was to brazenly defy a newly enacted law by taking the ownership of TikTok into his own hands. Bolton understood his mentality when he said, quote, he can't tell the difference between his own personal interest and the national interest, if he even understands what the national interest is, unquote. Attacks on news media. Shortly after taking office in 2017, Trump denounced the news media as, quote, the enemy of the American people, unquote, a phrase familiar from dictatorships abroad. His hostility never relented, but in his second term, it has reached new heights. Trump has threatened broadcast licenses, abused his regulatory authority, manipulated ownership deals, filed exorbitant lawsuits, played favorites with journalistic access, searched a reporter's home, and vilified news outlets and journalists. Although Trump cannot dominate news media in the United States in the way that Prime Minister Viktor Orban has done in Hungary, he is running the Orban playbook. No other president, not even Richard Nixon, no friend of the media, has used such blatantly illiberal tactics against the press. Territorial and military aggression. One reason I held out against identifying Trumpism with fascism in the first term was Trump's apparent lack of interest in aggression against other states. If anything, he had seemed shy about using force abroad. Well, that was then. In his second term, he has used military force promiscuously. Of course, many presidents have deployed force, but Trump's explicitly predatory use of it to grab Venezuela's oil and his gangster-style threat to take Greenland from Denmark, quote, the easy way, unquote, or, quote, the hard way, unquote, were 1930s-style authoritarian moves. The same goes for his contempt for international law, binding alliances, and transnational organizations such as the European Union, all of which impede the state's unconstrained exercise of its will, a central fascist tenet. Mussolini, quote, equally foreign to the spirit of fascism are all internationalistic or league superstructures which, as history shows, crumble to the ground whenever the heart of nations is deeply stirred by sentimental, idealistic, or practical considerations, unquote. Transnational reach. Like authoritarians generally, fascists love company. The world is safer for them if there are more of them. In his second term, Trump has broken his long-standing U.S. policy by dialing back support for human rights while praising and supporting authoritarian populists and illiberal nationalists in Serbia, Poland, Hungary, Germany, Turkey, El Salvador, and Slovakia, among other places, and by being weirdly deferential to the strongman Russian President Vladimir Putin. Even more striking is his de facto alignment against America's liberal allies and their parties in Europe, which he holds in contempt. Blood and soil nationalism. A fascist trademark is its insistence that the country is not just a collection of individuals, but a people, a Volk, a mystically defined and ethnically pure group bound together by shared blood, culture, and destiny. In keeping with that idea, Trump has repudiated birthright citizenship, and Vance has called to, quote, redefine the meaning of American citizenship in the 21st century, unquote, so that priority goes to Americans with longer historical ties, quote, the people whose ancestors fought in the Civil War, unquote, as he put it, or people whom others on the MAGA right call, quote-unquote, heritage Americans. In other words, some Americans are more Volkish than others. White and Christian nationalism. While Vance, Trump, and MAGA do not propound an explicit ideology of racial hierarchy, they make no secret of pining for a whiter, more Christian America. Trump has found many ways to communicate this, for example, by making clear his disdain for quote-unquote shithole countries and his preference for white Christian immigrants by pointedly accepting white South Africans as political refugees while closing the door to most other asylum seekers. By renaming military bases to share the names of Confederate generals after Congress ordered their names removed, by saying that civil rights laws led to whites being, quote, very badly treated, unquote. In his national security strategy, he chastises Europe for allowing immigration to undermine, quote, civilizational self-confidence, unquote, and proclaims, quote, we want Europe to remain European, unquote, a rallying cry of white Christian nationalists across the continent. Taking its cue, the Department of Homeland Security has propagated unashamedly white nationalist themes, and national parks and museums has scrubbed their exhibits of reference to slavery. Mobs and street thugs. The use of militias and mobs to harass, rough up, and otherwise intimidate opponents is a standard fascist stratagem. The textbook example being Hitler's Kristallnacht pogrom in 1938. As few will need reminding, the Trump MAGA parallel is the mob and militia violence against the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, 2021. Trump knowingly laid groundwork for this operation, calling on militia forces to, quote, stand back and stand by, unquote, in September 2020, and later dog whistled, quote, be there, will be wild, unquote, to his supporters. His pardon of all the Capitol attackers, more than 1,500, including the most violent, only proved what we knew, which is that they had his blessing. While Trump has found state violence adequate to his purposes so far in his second term, street violence is self-evidently in his repertoire. Leader aggrandizement. Since 2016, when he declared that, quote, I alone can fix it, unquote, and bragged that his supporters would remain loyal if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue, Trump has cultivated a personality cult. Although some of his efforts at self-aggrandizement can seem comical. The gilding of the Oval Office, the renaming of the Kennedy Center, the proposed triumphal arch, he understands the centrality of leader worship in a fascist-style regime. In sharp contradistinction to the American presidential tradition since George Washington, he makes no pretense of serving the people or the Constitution. His mindset, his symbolism, and his rhetoric all underscore the point he made to the New York Times this month. His own mind and morality are the only limits to his global power. This is Fascism 101. Alternative facts. As Orwell, Hannah Arendt, and practically every other scholar of authoritarianism has emphasized, creating a reality distortion field is the first thing a fascistic government will do. The better to drive its own twisted narrative, confuse the citizenry, demoralize political opponents, and justify every manner of corruption and abuse. While other presidents, including some good ones, have lied, none have come close to Trump's deployment of Russian-style mass disinformation. As I detail in my book, The Constitution of Knowledge, from the start of his first term, Trump has made quote-unquote alternative facts a hallmark of his governing style, issuing lies, exaggerations, and half-truths at the rate of 20 a day. Predictably, the second term has brought more of the same. Following his lead, a MAGA-fied postmodern right gleefully trashes objectivity as elitism and truth as a mask for power. Politics is war. A distinctive mark of fascism is its conception of politics, best captured by Carl Schmitt, an early 20th century German political theorist whose doctrines legitimized Nazism. Schmitt rejected the Madisonian view of politics as a social negotiation in which different factions, interests, and ideology come to agreement, the core idea of our Constitution. Rather, he saw politics as a state of war between enemies, neither of which can understand the other and both of which feel existentially threatened, and only one of them can win. The aim of Schmittian politics is not to share the country, but to dominate or destroy the other side. This conception has been evident in MAGA politics since Michael Anton, now a Trump administration official, published his famous article arguing that the 2016 election was a life and death battle to save the country from the left. A quote unquote Flight 93 election, quote, charge the cockpit or you die, unquote. In the speech given by Stephen Miller at Charlie Kirk's memorial service, MAGA's embrace of Smithian totalitism found its apotheosis. Quote, we are the storm, and our enemies cannot comprehend our strength, our determination, our resolve, our passion. You are nothing. You are wickedness, unquote. Governing as revolution. Although born in revolution, the American liberal tradition, especially its conservative branch, prizes continuity, stability, and incremental change guided by reason. Fascism, by contrast, quote, is not reactionary but revolutionary, unquote, as Mussolini insisted. It seeks to uproot and replace the old order and embraces bold, exhilarating action unshackled to rational deliberation. MAGA embraces its own revolutionary ethos, what Russell Vought, the administration's Office of Management and Budget Director, and probably its most formidable intellect, has called, quote-unquote, radical constitutionalism, a doctrine that would vitiate many checks on presidential power. In pursuit of this vision, Vought told Tucker Carlson in November 2024 interview, quote, the president has to move executively as fast and as aggressively as possible with a radical constitutional perspective to be able to dismantle that federal bureaucracy and their power centers, unquote, because, quote, the bureaucracies hate the American people, unquote. He predicted, quote, if you have a radical constitutionalism, it's going to be destabilizing, but it's also exhilarating, unquote. He said he would put federal agencies, quote, unquote, in trauma, an idea echoed by Christopher Rufo, an architect of Trump's attack on universities, which Rufo described as a quote-unquote counter-revolutionary blueprint to put universities, quote, in an existential terror, unquote. As Trump shuttered a congressionally mandated agency, renamed an international body of water, arrested an op-ed writer, deported immigrants to a foreign gulag, terrorized American cities, threatened an ally, and more, he showed how it looks when a radicalized state abandons rational deliberation and goes to war against itself. One can object that there are elements of classical European fascism that are not found in Trumpism, mass rallies and public rituals, for example, or that there are additional elements of Trumpism that belong on the list. MAGA's hypermasculinity, misogyny, and co-option of Christianity all resemble fascist patterns. The exercise of comparing fascism's various forms is not precise. If historians object that Trump is not a copy of Mussolini or Hitler or Franco, the reply is yes, but so what? Trump is building something new on old principles. He is showing us in real time what 21st century American fascism looks like. If, however, Trump is a fascist president, that does not mean that America is a fascist country. The courts, the states, and the media remain independent of him, and his efforts to browbeat them will likely fail. He may lose his grip on Congress in November. He has not succeeded in molding public opinion except against himself. He has outrun the mandate of his voters. His coalition is fracturing, and he has neglected tools that allow presidents to make enduring change. He and his party may defy the Constitution, but they cannot rewrite it, thank goodness. So the United States, once the world's exemplary liberal democracy, is now a hybrid state combining a fascist leader and a liberal constitution. But no, it has not fallen to fascism, and it will not. In which case, is there any point in calling Trump a fascist, even if true? Doesn't that alienate his voters? Wouldn't it be better just to describe his actions without labeling him controversially? Until recently, I thought so. No longer. The resemblances are too many and too strong to deny. Americans who support liberal democracy need to recognize what we're dealing with in order to cope with it, and to recognize something, one must name it. Trump has revealed himself, and we must name what we see. All right. End of article there. So despite this assumption of Trump came out of a vacuum and that like all of American history has been noble, that whole thing, I like this article, but and that's assumptions that me and the author and others can disagree on. But anyway, the point of bringing this article up and reading it to you is for a few reasons. So the first one, I love how this author focuses on definitions, argues that definitions are important. If words are thrown around willy-nilly, like we have seen with the term fascist, it loses its power, right? There's something, it seems innate to words, or at least how we understand them, that they mean things and that they have power to influence. And if a term is repeatedly used, like fascism has been recently, it kind of dilutes it and you can kind of dismiss it easier, whether justly or not. So I think this emphasis and analysis of definitions is important, especially when it comes to politics, public conversation, things like that. So I would agree with him. Fascism has been overused, and we need to look at, kind of how it's been defined in the past. And also, on the other hand, saying that, look, fascism is broad and it's kind of purposely like ill-defined, right? I feel like words are kind of like that, right? They kind of sit in the middle of being broad enough to describe different situations versus like being too broad or too overused that it's kind of meaningless. And I don't think that's talked about enough, honestly, in public discussions. So that's the first thing I love about this article is he's saying, look, we got to be careful with using the term fascism, but in my estimations, based on what I've seen so far, I think it applies. And second, related to that, our views should be changing. We should be questioning our views, especially as new data comes in, right? As he says, think of fascism more as like a constellation. Like there's different data points that we're getting, that we're putting together, right, that kind of build a constellation that looks like fascism, to kind of use a astronomy metaphor there. So though it may be kind of vague and like, he said Mussolini's fascism was different than Hitler's fascism, there are characteristics that they all share that Trump's governing style definitely shares, even though they may not be exactly alike, exactly the same to each other. They are, basically he's saying they are similar enough that we can say, yeah, Trump fits in this tradition of, fascist leaders, and he provides a lot of great data behind that, really drilling in on, okay, these are the exact actions Trump has taken. These are the words he said, whether they were a quote unquote joke or not. He has said them. These are what other fascists have said in the past. If it's one of those things, if it quacks like a duck, and yeah, I mean, I relate to that. I was, I've always kind of been hesitant to use the fascist term because it is such a powerful thing, but every, goodness, like every action he has taken has just like further confirmed it in my mind, in this author's mind. You may disagree with that. Your analysis may be a little bit different, but I think knowing our terms and trying to apply them to the world as we see it is very valuable. I mean, that's a lot of what critical thinking is. And then the last part here is towards the end, like that last paragraph or two, is he so he lays out his case. He basically, says like how bad things are, but he ends kind of on a more positive note of saying, fascism and Trump will not win in the end, and we gotta keep optimistic, positive for the future, that we can resist this, that we can stand up against this, and that not only can we get rid of it, but we can change, our society, our politics, to prevent this from happening to create, a better social order, which I'm totally on board with, and it's honestly kind of refreshing to read that last bit, especially compared to a lot of other media out there that very clearly tries to capitalize on, keeping you in fear, keeping you in hopelessness, keeping you depressed, all that type of stuff. I think this article does both things. So one, like I said, it does a good job of laying out all the dark shit that's been happening in detail. But then at the end, it's saying, hey, okay, we know this. We know it's fascist. Like, we know this term now. We know the playbook. We can respond to it, right? Fascist regimes, relatively compared to other regimes, last a short amount of time. Now, that may be, like 10 years of a fascist, but like, look how long, compare that to like how long democracies or countries, societies that have claimed to be democratic have lasted. Now, obviously, we can get into things like, oh, Russia, according to Vladimir Putin, Russia's a democracy. They still have votes. It's just that Vladimir Putin wins like 99% of the vote every time there's an election. So again, that kind of goes back to, we got to be careful with our terms. But anyway, all this is to say, I think he balanced it pretty well, laying out the problem, laying out the issue, laying out and kind of analyzing the dark shit, but then saying, look, despite all this, we know what's happening. We know the solutions. We have a system in America that sets us up better to deal with this than, say, post World War I Germany had, the Weimar Republic had in dealing with Hitler. And I truly believe that. That's also a big part of it, right? Is that we are a different society, than even like Orban in Hungary, different places like that. And there's a lot of advantages we need to recognize and grasp onto and use. And I think people are waking up to this. I think the shock has worn off more or less. And we just need to keep driving that forward, right? Keep fighting, keep resisting, say no. It can be as simple as that, just like saying, no, I'm not going to go along with this. We need as much as that as possible. But we also need to bring ideas for a hopeful future, right? Like, how do we fix our society so that another Trump doesn't happen? So that, this Trumpism, this MAGA, when Trump is gone, like, will also leave us too. Right now it's still uncertain, but that should motivate us to be like, fuck no. We're done with this. We've seen this. We've seen too much of this play. We're walking out into the sunlight, right? We're making something better. We're making a better movie, right? Because this one is just terrible. And having that mindset is what we need to do, which kind of leads into my call to action today, and that's basically just find an issue that you're passionate about, whether it's, prison abolition, abortion and women's health care access, trans issues. We need to protecting trans youth, from these ridiculous attacks. All types of different things out there. Whether that's on the local level, your city council, whether that's on the state level, working with state representatives, whatever. It can be small things, right? Like writing your elected officials a letter saying, don't put up with this shit. And if ICE tries to come to town, use everything in your power. We will use everything in our power to stop them, to make it harder, to make their lives miserable in a way. So that's kind of the end of what I had to say today, I guess. The last thing I'll say, and I've said it a couple times now, I would love feedback. So suggestions on segments I should do in this show, suggestions on what news sources I should be looking at, what topics you want discussed. Do you want more information on how to vote? I'll probably provide that anyway later on, because it's super important. What are things you want to hear about? Maybe you want to hear a little bit more about me. That's fine. I'm a pretty open book. I don't quite like to yap as much about myself as I do politics and other stuff, but I'm open. Let's have that conversation. Any questions, any comments, anything like that. Best way to get those to me in the show is to send it to the email. I think the email will be down here somewhere, hopefully. But for those of you who are listening, it is notes, NOTES, at mail.coop. So once again, that's notes, NOTES, at mail.coop. Co-op is COOP. And that's the best way to get in touch with me. This show will be published on a lot of your favorite podcast sites. I'll upload it to YouTube. So I'm not a huge social media person. I mean, like a lot of you, I think social media is just becomes more and more toxic every day. But I also recognize it's a useful tool to get the message out. And as I develop that more, I'll be sending that or I'll let you guys know that information. So we have different ways to connect. But anyway, that's it. That's it for this show. I hope you have a great day. Stay safe, stay connected. And that's it. Peace.